Okay, that's it. Ready? Okay. Wow, that was fun. Okay. Do I have to get violent? Okay. Okay. So there are lots of questions, and they're really good questions. And we obviously don't have time for a lot of them, but we'll try and pick up a bunch. And I'm actually very pleased that there are no anonymous questions, which is a first. So, Jacob W. Where are you, Jacob? Yay! Okay. So we'll start with chimpanzees.
Okay.
Do chimpanzees exhibit violence against other species of apes? And could this quality have played a role in the dominance of Homo sapiens over other humanoids?
Do chimpanzees exhibit violence towards other species of apes? Well, there are two species of apes that live in the same environments as chimpanzees. One is gorillas, and no one has seen anything like violence directed by chimpanzees towards gorillas, and you think you know why? The other species is humans, and chimpanzees have actually occasionally harmed humans. They have killed babies on several different occasions in several different countries. They are dangerous. Now, the second part of the question was something like, could this explain the dominance of Homo sapiens?
I guess assuming maybe killing Neanderthals or something like that, I guess is the idea. Okay.
Dr. Krauss gets a gold star. And so does the questioner. Certainly, we don't know what is responsible for sapiens outcompeting all of the other hominoids, but you have to say that given the way in which chimpanzees behave and given the way in which our own species has behaved when we come into contact with other members of our species that we did not know before, then you have to say that war is very likely being a part of the interspecies contact. But of course, we do know also that it wasn't totally eliminating because we've all got our 3 to 4% Neanderthal genes. Well, most of you anyway.
Okay, anyone else have any? Okay, we'll go to the next one. It's actually a quick question for Sarah, I think. From Sylvia, wherever you are. Okay, Sylvia's more quiet than Jacob, but that's good. What defines an in or out group, and who is Turkana and who is not? Is it just a political tag, and therefore the violence okay?
So the Turkana are about 1 million people, and they constitute what people would call an ethno-linguistic group. So they speak a language, and the most important thing is that they share cultural norms, beliefs, ideas, and a way of doing things. And so that's in some ways what defines the ethno-linguistic group, not a certain number of people, because we know that ethno-linguistic groups have gone from being really small, a few hundred people, 1,000 people in some hunter-gatherer societies, to nation states in which, or religious entities in which thousands and millions of people constitute a shared cultural group. So in some ways, the Turkana are a tribe in which everybody agrees on certain social norms, on certain beliefs about how to treat others, how to do things, and that's what constitutes the in-group.
Okay.
Add something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I teach introductory psychology, and one of the staples of the introductory psychology curriculum is the minimal group experiment, which shows that our cognitive boundaries of what is an in-group and out-group can be highly malleable. In this experiment, you divide people up as they come into the lab on any trivial criterion you want. You are the fans of Clay, you are the fans of Kandinsky, and immediately each group thinks the worse of each other and they favor their in-group members over members of the other group. Even, by the way, if they're divided by the flip of a coin, you're in that group, you're in the other group, and they immediately start to distrust each other. For years, this was thought of as a rather depressing fact about our species. Clearly, it's the cognitive ability that gets engaged by ethno-linguistic groups in a more natural context. But on the other hand, the boundaries are so elastic that we can expand them as well as creating new divisions. And one of the things that seems to have been happening that's behind the decline of war is that we no longer as easily think of other ethno-linguistic groups as outgroups. A salient case would be the attitude toward, say, the Japanese, which, needless to say, during World War II, Japanese were treated as subhuman. There were all kinds of demeaning racial stereotypes. And now, I think most of us, even if we tried, could really not muster a whole lot of hatred against the Japanese, if for no other reason that they, make our Nikon and Sony appliances. And indeed, the rise of trade has been credited as one of the things that helps expand the cognitive boundaries of who's in your group and who isn't. If people are your trading partners, you're less likely to want them to come to harm. You need them to buy your stuff, you need them to sell you their stuff.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Adrian, you provoked a lot of questions. You stimulated, I don't know whether it was the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala, but you stimulated a lot. Sarah asked the following question. I find this a fascinating question. What would you advise parents of young children between newborn and 7 years old to do to help stimulate the prefrontal cortex? So I think that's a wonderful question.
Great question, Sarah. Very good one. Well, first of all, I think there's things you can do even before the borns, because we know that mums during pregnancy who smoke cigarettes, their offspring are 3 times more likely to grow up to become violent criminal offenders. If she has poor nutrition during pregnancy, they're 2.5 times more likely to grow up to become offenders. We know that alcohol during pregnancy raises the odds also of juvenile delinquency and adult crime. So even before the child is born, there are things that people can do, that we can do, society can do, to take away these teratogens which affect the developing fetal brain, which have knock-on effects to future crime. But I imagine, all of you out there with the younger kids, 7, 8, 9, turning away from my research, parenting, parent skills. It's something that we need to do more of. We know that poor parenting is associated with crime. We know that programs that enhance parenting skills reduce antisocial behavior in children. And, when I step back from that and I think, well, I've got 2 kids and I'm not such a great parent. And I think, well, was I ever taught how to be a parent in school? No, I wasn't. Is having a kid one of the most important things that any of us ever does? Yes. It's the one thing we're taught nothing about in school. So I wonder whether we would ever make parent skills classes compulsory to high school, secondary school students to enhance the level of parenting for all of us. And, what's so bad about that? That's something I wonder about.
We should all wonder about that, I think. Anyone else have any advice for parents?
Yeah, I obviously want to concentrate on environmental levers of influence on all aspects of the developing child. I tend to think that we underestimate the role of the peer environment, and that parents sometimes get blamed a little too quickly. A lot of studies that look at effects of parenting never control for the fact that parents are genetically related to their kids. And so if you have parents who are likely to engage in a particular kind of behavior, they are likely to have kids who are genetically more predisposed to do some things as opposed to others. And unless you do the studies with adopted kids, it's very hard to distinguish whether it's the parenting per se or the kind of people who do the parenting, which is not to contradict the idea that people should be instructed on the basic qualifications for not screwing up your kid. But I think we shouldn't, though, because it's so easy to equate nurture environment with parenting, we forget about a source of the environment that I think is far more consequential, and that is the peer group. Something that's obviously much harder to control, but when you grow up, you have the language of your peer group, you have the accent of your peer group, you wear the same styles of clothing, you listen to the same kinds of music. That is a massive environmental influence that is a little harder to control because there are no classes to control a peer group. It's a viral phenomenon where fads come and go and things reach a tipping point. But a better understanding of the dynamics that lead to whether it's cool to be a juvenile delinquent or it's cool to stay in school would be another way of influencing likelihood of violence through an environmental manipulation.
Here's a question actually related to an environmental factor from Julia. And this is a question that's often asked, and it wasn't discussed anywhere here, so it's open to everybody to jump in quickly. Does exposure to violence or violent entertainment encourage violent behavior? So who wants to start?
I know a little bit about that. It's not my area of research, but experimental studies have shown that exposure to violent video games, violent TV, does have a little bit of effect in raising the chance of aggressive behavior in the kid. It's especially true of kids who are already at risk for being antisocial and aggressive. But there is experimental research on that, as well as, hundreds upon hundreds of studies showing this relationship.
I'm going to take a slightly contrarian view of that. It is certainly true that if you were to poll most psychologists, they would say that there is a relationship. But Christopher Ferguson and others have cast a lot of doubt on whether those studies have anything to do with violence as we really care about it, like real harm, or just kids being a little more rambunctious after they see a Roadrunner cartoon, or filling out a questionnaire and being more likely to unscramble words so that they spell out the violent words. Measures that are not terribly connected with real life. And in fact, if you look at, I tend to think that the concern over violent video games is a kind of moral panic that flies in the face of what's happened in society as a whole. Namely that during the era in which violent video games, including the gruesome first-person shooter games, just exploded in popularity, violent crime in real life has fallen through the floor. The rate of violent crime in the United States today is less than half of what it was 20 years ago. No one completely understands the reason, but this is the same era in which we've had special effects in movies that seem to increase the level of simulated violence and the popularity of violent video games. Also, Harold Schechter, who's actually studied the history of violent entertainment, points out that pretty much at all points of history, people take enormous pleasure in watching scenes of gruesome violence enacted before their eyes. If you look at Shakespearean tragedies, if you look at Punch and Judy, if you look at Penny Dreadfuls and Pulp Fiction and the Lives of the Saints, the Old Testament, there's gruesome entertainment all the way through. And I think I tend to think that people disconnect it from whether they want to commit violence in real life.
Anyone want to disagree with both these gentlemen? Go ahead.
And by the way, the solution to parenting is to become a grandparent. It's a lot easier. All the fun and none of the trouble. The one thing we might discuss or have on the table at least is the question is why isn't there more violence given how easy it is to do? And let me just give you a couple of sort of comparisons. The worst societies pretty much are ones that have a homicide rate of about 100 in 100,000. There's some cases where it's even worse than that, but that's really bad and pretty unusual. And the question is if you live in that society, some of the worst societies there are in terms of homicide, your chance of being killed is about 1 in 1,000 per year. And the question is, why isn't that 1 in 500 or 1 in 200? Why doesn't it get higher? So that is an interesting sort of thing. I was talking to one of the people here now at the conference about homicide in Japan, which is now so low. It's a question that could it conceivably get lower? I mean, Japan and everybody else has a certain quota of murderous psychopaths, and you're down to the level where you're basically at that level.
They eat a lot of fish in Japan, by the way.
Yeah.
They eat their whole body weight in fish every year.
And they play a lot of video games in Japan.
Let me give you one other statistic. Everybody in here who is over the age of 14 lived during the 20th century, a very murderous time with big wars and so forth, and also murderous governments, which killed more people than wars. And I tried to calculate, if you were a resident of the 20th century, what was the likelihood you'd be killed either by a government or by a war, any kind of war, civil war, international war, or whatever. And it comes out to be somewhere between 1% and 2% over a lifetime, which would end, of course. They stopped counting. And so then the question is, if you're an American, what's your chance each year of being, over a lifetime, of being killed in an automobile accident? It's about between 1% and 2%. And it's sort of an eerie comparison, one of obviously we're completely tolerant of, having this murderous form of transportation. The other we're not acceptable of. So it's I'm not sure what that comparison does, but it's sort of interesting. It seems.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that knowing the numbers on rates of violence is a highly informative and educational way of approaching it, to put things in perspective, which you don't do reading the newspaper, where the human mind, because of the availability heuristic, just judges probability based on how easy it is to recall anecdotes and events. So numbers matter. So let's just take as a comparison. So the most violent countries in the world today have a homicide rate of 100 per 100,000 per year. Japan and other peaceful countries, it's less than 1 per 100,000 per year. Richard, do you know what the figures are for chimpanzees? And Sarah, do you know what the figures are for the Turkana?
The estimates are in the low hundreds, something like 1 or 200, which is lower than some of the hunter-gatherers, certainly. 1 or 200 per 100,000.
Do those figures exist for the Turkana?
So I know the data that 1% of male adult mortality is due to interpersonal violence.
That's over a lifetime.
Yeah, 1%, but 50% from intertribal warfare.
Okay. Well, we'll move to Erica. I'm trying to get a question for everyone. I want to end with another question. But Erica, this is one that occurred to me too. And in your study, how do you determine change or success in a movement? What determines whether it's a success?
Mm-hmm. Well, we used a pretty strict metric. There are a couple of criteria the movement has to meet. The first is that it achieved either the removal of a leader completely through irregular means, or they achieved territorial independence, that is, de jure independence, not just de facto independence. And that would basically be similar to the selection criteria of the cases. We only looked at those cases where they were trying to remove the incumbent leader through irregular means, or that they were trying to achieve territorial independence. The second criteria was that we looked at whether the campaign could have had, you can sort of make a reasonably good argument that the campaign had a direct impact on that outcome, right? So if an international power came in and just took out the leader, we didn't count that as a campaign success. If the leader died in office of a heart attack, even though you might make a conceivable argument that they were stressed out because of the movement and died, we didn't want to give our skeptics any ammunition. So we didn't count that as a success. So we only looked at cases where it was clear that the movement had an impact on the outcome, and that outcome had to have occurred within a year of the peak of the campaign. Meaning that if a campaign ends, but then 4 years later they get the outcome that they wanted, we didn't count that as a success. So this is actually a very strict criterion of success. We applied it equally across both the nonviolent and violent campaigns, just to defend against any skepticism that we were going easy on the nonviolent cases.
Okay, great. Now, we don't have much time. We started 10 minutes late, so I want to try and... but I have one quick question for John. I'm sure a lot of people... This is the kind of question you get a lot, so I thought I'd pick this one. It's from Michelle. And it said, if war is on the decline, and the last war is many years ago, how do you explain the conflict of the U.S. is engaged in Iraq, Afghanistan right now?
Yeah, there's a phenomenon, I call it policing wars. After the end of the Cold War, the notion was that there weren't really big enemies anymore among developed states, and they all saw the world pretty much the same way. So, example, there's a civil war in Bosnia. They didn't necessarily know how to solve the problem, but they all agreed that it was a bad thing. So since the end of the Cold War, there's been a bunch of policing wars in which troops from developed countries have been sent into various areas to try to either stop civil wars or to replace regimes that are basically really horrible and killing their own people. And there's been a number of these. They do not seem to be. It does not seem to be a growth industry. And so I would put both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly the one in Afghanistan, in that category. In general, no one wants to lose very many lives in those kinds of things because they're essentially humanitarian, and these two wars are obviously tied to a belief that they're relevant to national interest. At any rate, I think we're now living through something called the Iraq syndrome, or maybe the Iraq-Afghanistan syndrome, and the enthusiasm for engaging in any more wars like that is extremely low, as we saw this summer. Last summer with respect to the Syrian thing. No one even wanted to think about even punitive bombing in which no Americans would be killed to punish Assad for using chemical weapons. And Barack Obama, moving in that direction, backed away. And I think we lived after Vietnam with the Vietnam syndrome. We lived after World War II with the World War II syndrome. There were no more World War IIs, no more Korean wars. And I think we're now in the Iraq syndrome, and it's very unlikely that they will venture into other conflicts of that sort unless there's a really direct attack on the United States.
Okay, that's probably going to cause some discussion during the break, I bet. But the last question, I think, since we're going to go to the future after the break, I thought this was appropriate. And it's from Kathleen, and it's sort of directed towards you. But is there any danger of society using the brain functioning of potential criminals in a sort of Minority Report style pre-crime punishment system? That is, accusing and condemning people before they commit a crime based on their brain functioning. Go ahead.
Kathleen, I think this is a great question, and I have a vested interest in this insofar as my brain scan looks very much like that of a man who killed 64 people in a 12-year period. And I do not want to be locked up for a crime I did not commit just because of my brain scan. Or if you do lock me up, I want a chance to kill some of my critics first before you lock me up. But yes, but this is, seriously, it's an important question, and it's one of concern, the Minority Report. Will we ever screen and intervene earlier on in life because all the boxes are checked? The social boxes, the psychological, the genetic, the brain. And I think there's a legitimate concern about that. I'm partly guilty of this because with my colleagues and I, we brain scanned adults in the community and found that those with a smaller volume of the amygdala, part of the brain that gives us a sense of compassion, conscience, and remorse, those men with the smaller amygdala volumes were 4 times more likely to commit a violent act in the next 3 years. And that's prediction over and above other risk factors we use to predict violence, like employment, background, and so on. So I'm torn. At one level, no, it would be terribly wrong to detain someone before they've committed a criminal act. On the other hand, we have to make decisions every day about which prisoners to let out early because they're not at risk, and which prisoners to keep in prison because they are dangerous. And if brain imaging and genetics in the future gives us added value in making more accurate decisions about who are the risky people in society, well, wouldn't it be wrong not to use that information?
Okay, well, I know that that's going to lead to discussion, so I'm going to stop it. One of the things we try and do in Origins is deal with open questions, questions that haven't been resolved, fundamental questions where we might learn things. And of course, one of the things I've seen from this meeting is that this is such a question. And questions that allow us to confront conventional wisdom and to try and make the world a better place. And I want to thank this panel for illuminating these issues for us before this. We will see you in the very short future to discuss the future. Have a good intermission.